Hello, my name is Llŷr Gwyn Lewis, and my first book of prose to be published was Rhyw Flodau Rhyfel in 2014 by Lolfa. The book's been translated into English as Flowers of War by Katie Gramich and into French by Marie-Thérèse Castet, and I'm very grateful to both for their truly wonderful work. I was very fortunate also to have won the Creative Non-Fiction Award for this book at the Wales Book of the Year Awards in 2015. The book's central theme is remembrance and commemoration, with regard in particular to the legacy of the two world wars and their effect on Europe, on Wales, and on the narrator himself. It seeks to question and to challenge the personal and cultural memory of those wars, and so I wrote it as a piece of autofiction in a sense, or a mixture of memoir, travelogue, fiction, and a smattering of literary criticism as well, as I sought to blur and obscure the boundary between these genres and the novel. This was in order to question even my own personal memories, let alone our national and international interpretations and memorializations of those wars. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The book's starting point is a small package containing letters and papers, diaries given to me by my late grandfather, and relating to his brother, who was killed in Syria during the Second World War. So as I try to uncover and understand what led to his death at the hand of the Vichy French in a battle outside Damascus, this journey leads me to meditate on the horror and the human impact of wars, but also on my own memories of family and of travelling as well through Europe with friends, where everywhere still seemed to exist under the shadow of those two horrendous wars in one sense or another. This then leads me also to meditate on and perhaps try to resist, in a sense, the jingoistic manner in which the tremendous sacrifice of those generations are being appropriated and weaponized to often pernicious ends today. Now, though the book was originally published in 2014, the narrative's main time frame is during the period of around 2011 to 2012, when the Syrian civil war was beginning to ravage that country, of course, and so making it impossible in turn for me to visit my great-uncle's grave. But this was also, of course, a period before Brexit, before Trump, before coronavirus, and in the book, the narrator tentatively laments the fact that the world in which he lives, the Europe in which he lives, the United Kingdom, and the Wales in which he lives, seems to be languishing in a sort of post-historical, consumerist, apathetic mire. Now, there was something uncomfortable about uncovering my grandparents and their generations past, and that was to me an underlying sense of envy, perhaps even of jealousy, that they'd lived through such turbulent times, and I wanted to try to express that honestly and unflinchingly in the book. Of course, be careful what you wish for, they say, and it's interesting to me now to look back on this book and to read it afresh in the light of our own recent and troubling experiences, locally and worldwide. But ultimately, my hope with this book is that an entirely personal history can be woven, in a sense, into a more general exploration of history and memory through the use of various genres, such as the travelogue, diary entries, letters and the like, as well as some visual images too. The prose itself was intended to be somewhat somnambulant, mimicking the paths that memories make through the mind, but also constrained in the same way as memory, reaching out towards something that can never quite be entirely successfully grasped, apprehended or recalled. Because as hard as this book tries, I never will get to know my great-uncle or even begin to comprehend what he experienced prior to his death. And I hope that in acknowledging this, despite all the book's wandering and its exploration of the boundary between fact and fiction, there is a sort of honesty at its core as well. I'm going to read an extract to you, a couple of sentences first in Welsh, and then I'll read from Katie Gramich's wonderful translation of Rhyw Flodau Rhyfel, Flowers of War. I'll begin with a short piece where the narrator explores his own contentious, conflicted feelings on the impact of war, and then move on to an extract where he returns home for a few days and goes to visit his grandparents in order to listen to some of their memories of the war. So in Welsh first, a couple of sentences. Meddyliwn am bobl megis Frans Fanon, y meddyliwr gwrthdrafedigaethol a brofodd erchyllderau hiliol Ffrancwyr Fisi yn ystod yr Rhyfel, ond a fyd andylanwad y profiadau hynny am weddill I oes. Aml I dro yn un donedd a chai ddiwedd diddianc fy mywyd am gwaith bob dydd, de'r dysyfiad, y ffantasi hyd yn oed, y byddai rhyw ryfel mawr hen ffasiwn yn torri, ac y byddai'n rheidrwydd arna fi fynd ymaith I ymladd. I thought about individuals like Frans Fanon, the anti-colonial thinker who had racist atrocities perpetrated against him by the Vichy French during the war and had been influenced by those experiences for the rest of his life. Often, amidst the monotony and inescapable restrictions of my daily life and work would come the desire, the fantasy even, that some big old-fashioned war would break out and I would be forced to go away and fight. Such a departure would be a compulsory uprooting, in which I would be posted to a remote city or a barren desert, to Trieste like James Morris or Dar es Salaam like Roald Dahl, or somewhere distant of that ilk at the very edges of empire, and invariably in the dying days of the war. Tell me, is there a more romantic phrase than this amid the great riches of the English language? The dying days of the war. Of course, there would be a heartbroken girl in some cottage somewhere waiting for me, darning socks and biting her nails to the quick as she listened to the ticking of the clock and gazed soulfully through the window, and I would, in due course, be overcome by the romance and tragedy of it all. Of course, that would be to use the compulsion and duress of war, to use the heroic, brave arena of that, ironically enough, to make up for my own cowardice. It is cowardice, a feeling of impotence, the unconquerable burden of having to make choices in the midst of a world laden with a plethora of choices and decisions that has meant that I am, until this very day, sitting and staring at a blank screen, trying to write or failing to concentrate on a paragraph in a book, rather than jettisoning all this work, all the rituals of relations and acquaintances, all the bonds of family and society and nation, and picking up my knapsack to journey to the other side of the world once again. It was because of this that I was envious of Uncle John, of Cynan, of Churchill and of Frans Fanon. They had no choice but to stand up and be counted, to take that risk, and in the case of my Uncle John, to lose the gamble, but in the case of, say, Churchill or Saunders Lewis, it gave them that astonishing mixture of a sense of adventure and rash patriotism that drove them on to lead, to display bravery, and to make their most defiant declarations. In the case of Fanon, the experience influenced his worldview and politics so completely that it meant that, even bearing in mind that the fact that he died suddenly at the age of 36, his writing would be acknowledged as among the most important voices of protest against the greed of imperialism and colonialism. Because of these things, I was envious of them, almost against my own will and instinct, that war, in addition to killing men, also made men. And then the second extract from slightly further on in the book. And this is when the narrator goes to speak to his grandparents to garner their recollections of the war. Roedden ni'n cysgu ar slats, nid ar lawr, medda taid. Pawb ohonon ni o gwmpas y polyn yng nghanol y babell, a'n traed tuag I mewn at y canol. Mi oedd na lefnyn mawr, rhingill dwi'n meddwl oedd o, ac mi fydde fo'n cadw I watch ymlaen I esgyd wyddos di, wrth ochr I wely troedd o'n cysgu. Ac os bydde ti eisiau gwybod yr amser, yna mi fydde rhaid I ti ddod o hyd i'r esgyd mewn nghanol nos, ac ysgwyd y watch allan ohoni, heb ddeffro'r rhingill. We slept on wooden slats on the floor, said Grandad. All of us around the pole in the middle of the tent with our feet pointing inwards. There was a big fellow there, a sergeant I think he was, and he used to keep his watch inside his boot, and keep it by his bed as he slept. And if you wanted to know what the time was, you had to find this boot in the middle of the night and shake the watch out of it without waking the sergeant. And in the morning, you had to make your bed and put everything outside, folded neatly in a little pile, and your boots on top, all polished and laced up and everything. And then what we'd do is we'd go on a march, say 5 miles out towards the sea and then back. And what you had there was a bunch of boys from what they called a borstal, a school for bad boys. And of course, about 1 mile into the march, these boys would start to limp, you see, and complain, and the office would say, well, you'd better go back. But of course, they were going back to steal our things, the rascals. Another time, we had to wait to go to the mess, Grandad reminisced. And when we got there, the officers were already eating. And one of their borstal youngsters went up then to make a complaint. "Sit down," this officer said in English, as the lad went on complaining. "You sit down now," he shouted. And this boy said that he wouldn't sit down until we've been served first. You see, he didn't go in and sit down and then reach out for the buns or whatever. No, you would grab whatever you could get as soon as you went in through the door, or you wouldn't get a thing. Goodness, we had a whale of a time. He spoke then about one lad who stole the basins from the wash huts and took them home in his case. He went to Australia later on, said Grandad contemplatively. And Grandma butted in sharply to ask, he didn't take the basin with him, I hope? He told me then about going home to Llanfyllin through Llangilynnin, Dolgella, Llangadfan and Llanfihangel. And he hadn't left his bike there because he didn't know anyone in the town at the time. And so he had to walk home to Llangedwin, a good 6 miles away, late at night. And he told me that he remembered it being pitch black, but that the searchlights in Shrewsbury and Oswestry could be seen from time to time lighting up the sky, and even sometimes the road out in front of him. Another time, he remembered standing outside the house on the hillside, looking at the sky, which was all lit up because they had been bombing the outskirts of Wrexham, which was 30 miles away. Grandma also remembered, though she lived a bit further away, seeing the searchlights as she cycled home, and she remembered the evacuees who had lived with him. She'd even been to seek them out again in the south a few times over the years, long after the war was over. Grandad didn't remember much about his evacuees, except that they were 2 boys from Liverpool and that they were allowed to go home to their mother from time to time, because by that time he himself was lodging in Llanfyllin during the week because he was attending the county school. But he did remember the prisoners of war who were brought to the neighbourhood, and he said that still today he couldn't taste rice pudding without thinking of them, thinking specifically of a German who came to stay on a neighbouring farm, and the farmer finding a violin with no strings somewhere. The German became obsessed with it, cleaning and polishing the violin every night, finding some strings, and then the fun they had in the evenings and in country dances, for the German played the violin so well. There were tears in Grandad's eyes when he talked about the German going around the neighbourhood with a family to play in village halls and vestries, and about the great welcome the family had received when they visited Germany after the war. Grandad looked really proud of that welcome. These other scraps and fragments came out all mixed together, and the 2 of them were finishing each other's stories almost as if they were competing with each other, and I felt that I was back there with them, because they certainly had gone back decades. Grandma talked about her brother David, who pretended in the camp that he could neither speak nor understand English, and so did daft things like not shutting the door behind him or turning left on a march when everyone else was turning right. Perhaps he was the most sensible of us all? "Were you afraid?" I asked. "Goodness me, yes. It was a strange old time, wasn't it?" was the answer. And then the 2 went on to talk about Lord Haw-Haw broadcasting his lies and his terrifying news to frighten everyone, and some local man in his Anderson shelter, frying bacon and listening to the wireless, and Lord Haw-Haw saying, "The British are starving," and getting so angry that he ran out from the shelter, holding the frying pan up in the air and shouted to the invisible airwaves, "Smell that then, you bugger!"